Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Ateo. I am one of the 2020 co-chairs for the Staff Advisory Council. Thank you so much for joining us for the Spring 2020 Faculty in Focus. The Office of the Provost and the Staff Advisory Council started Faculty in Focus a few years ago to help bridge the gap between faculty and staff. The staff are granted the opportunity to listen to a member of our faculty discuss their scholarship. The Office of the Provost and the Staff Advisory Council wanted to continue this great program, even though we are mostly working remotely. So thank you to Marissa Quinn, Beth Travis, and the Office of the Provost for the hard work in making this Faculty in Focus a possibility. This webinar will be moderated. Your microphones will be muted. There will be time for questions and answers towards the end of the webinar. If you have a question, please utilize the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. At this time, I'd like to introduce Brown University's Provost, Richard Locke. Provost Locke was the first member of the faculty to present his scholarship at our first Faculty in Focus. We were all fascinated with his presentation on economic and political consequences of sweatshops. Without further ado, let me introduce Provost Richard Locke.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all, and thanks for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you, Michael, for co-sponsoring this series and for all the work that you and the Staff Advisory Council colleagues do to promote community at Brown. You know, given the current circumstances that we're living through these days, these kinds of activities are more important than ever. It's been a genuine pleasure to work with Michael and others as part of SAC on this series, but also on the staff summer readings program. Now, this is the 6th of these lectures, and the response has been incredibly strong. Even virtually, it seems to me that this kind of programming is so important to unite us as a community, and you know, God knows, we all need that these days. I'd also like to thank our colleagues in media services and university events for the support to make this event possible, but also so many other events that have occurred over the last couple months. It's through their skilled partnership that we've been able to continue to offer exceptional programming, even as we are dispersed as a community working from home or working remotely. And while I genuinely miss seeing everyone in person over lunch at the faculty club, and I look forward to having those events someday soon, I know that it's important to continue these series, and it's really wonderful to see so many people participating. Now, for me, and I've talked about this before, I'm especially enthusiastic about the Faculty in Focus series because we get to hear from faculty across the university in many different disciplines about what's driving their current interest and their curiosity about, you know, their own work, but also about the pressing issues that are impacting our world today. And I've said this before, we have an amazing faculty here at Brown who are doing truly consequential work, and hearing from them reminds me at least, and hopefully it reminds all of you of the important work that takes place at Brown every day. Today, we are very fortunate to hear from Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, Stephen Porder. Now, Stephen came to Brown in 2007, following a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University. His work focuses on the interdisciplinary investigation of terrestrial ecosystems. By combining ecology, biogeochemistry, and geology, he investigates how the Earth works, what humans are doing to alter those functions, and what the consequences may be for its inhabitants and ecosystems. Now, I've seen Stephen present many times. He's excellent, an excellent presenter, excellent scholar, excellent teacher. And I've seen him present truly sobering, data-driven presentations about the urgency of climate change and the pressing need for policy initiatives to address this challenge. It's a great challenge, perhaps the greatest challenge that we face as a society these days. And because of his knowledge and his expertise, after listening to several of these presentations, we recruited him to help the university to basically help us address these challenges, to take action and to develop a strategic plan to reduce our overall environmental impact and strengthen our university community environmental sustainability. So in addition to Stephen's faculty appointment, over the last year or so, Stephen has worked as Assistant Provost for Sustainability to engage the entire university community to develop a plan for Brown to achieve net zero emissions within the next couple decades. It's a very ambitious plan, but it's an achievable plan, and it's a plan that we have to, as an institution, pursue because it's core to our values, and it's core to our future, and it's core to our role in the society. Now, over these last couple of years, I've really enjoyed getting to know and work closely with Stephen. For me, Stephen embodies the very best of Brown. He's a deeply committed and talented scholar and teacher who's applying his knowledge to affect meaningful change in the world. And that's what Brown's all about. We're incredibly grateful to what Stephen does on campus with his courses, what he does through his research, and of course, what he's doing as Assistant Provost for Sustainability. And I'm especially thankful, Stephen, that in your very, very busy schedule, you've taken the time to share with all of us the work that you're doing these days, and to speak with us today on life's master regulators, the chemical keys to changing the world. So with that, thank you, Stephen, and please, everyone, join me in welcoming Stephen Porder.
Rick, I'm really blushing from that introduction, so thank you very much. We're going to talk about just a few little things today that I think about. So we're going to cover 3.5 billion years or so of history of life on Earth. We're going to cover the meaning of life, and we're going to cover sustainability, and hopefully I'll still have time for lunch. So I chose this topic because I am a biologist, and I chose this picture because it embodies a lot of what life is about. This is a picture of my daughter a few years ago and myself in the Amazon on a field trip that we went on with a bunch of Brown undergrads, actually, as part of a course I was teaching. And so I thought it would be appropriate to start this talk with a question that is very, very broad, and one that would be addressed across the university in a variety of ways. What is life? Now, as a philosopher, or as a religious scholar, or as a person of faith, this question might have any number of different answers. But as a biologist, the way that we think about life really comes from the organizing principles of Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. So when we think about life and we try to understand how life works, we think about the history of life. So this is what we call the tree of life. And you probably saw this in some textbook at some point in your life. And what I wanted to do is say, okay, we know that all life is descended from a single common organism. The genetics of life tell us that. And we can classify those organisms, and we can think about how they work and how one group works or another group works, or how these organisms interact. But I wanted to take a step back from that and put the tree of life in the context of what we're looking at in this photo. So you see my daughter, you see this huge mushroom. I guess I can point with my cursor. Her huge mushroom in the front. That mushroom is actually growing out of a giant termite mound. So the termites are farming the fungi underground. This mushroom is an expression of that. You see plants. Everything you see in this picture is simply this little bit of the tree of life. So as a biologist, I find it somewhat overwhelming that I can go to the Amazon rainforest and look around at the most diverse habitat on the planet, and I can still only see, with my eyes at least, a very, very, very teeny fraction of life on Earth. So in my field, we tend to think about life in a slightly different way, even than most biologists. So many biologists might study the interaction between an animal and a plant, or a predator and prey, or even a food web. We tend to think about it a little bit differently in my field. And I want to tell you about the sort of oversimplification that we make in my particular subdiscipline, and why that's useful, particularly in understanding global change, which is where I'm going to hope to end up by the end of this talk. So we tend to think of life as chemical elements. We are what are called biogeochemists. And if you took a look at the chemical formula that I popped up on the right-hand side of the screen, and don't worry, there's no test on this, okay? That is the chemical formula of one of the organisms in this picture. And if I were doing this live in front of a live audience that I could see, I would make you guess, but I'm not going to make you guess. It's actually the chemical formula of the people in this picture. But interestingly enough, it's not a bad approximation of the chemical formula of all of the organisms in this picture. So the only difference really between the formula of me and the formula of the plants behind me is that I have a little bit more calcium, that's the Ca on the top right, because I have bones and the plants don't. And they have a little more carbon, but you know, it's all in the noise. So you might say, well, okay, we can approximate this little bit of the tree of life. It includes animals and fungi and plants. What about something really far away on the tree of life? Let's go all the way over to the other side and look in the bacteria. And if we look at the chemical formula of that group of the tree of life, and by the way, that's what these look like under a microscope. These are cyanobacteria. It looks something like this. Now, don't worry, I don't expect you to remember the previous formula. I'm going to put them both on the same page. And if you look at the far left one, circled in blue, and read out the letters, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, HOCNP. And then you look at the ones on the far right, HOCN, there's the calcium for the bones in me, and then P. You've probably noticed that there's a similarity. Now, I admit readily that approximating life as a chemical formula misses huge amounts of what life really is. We are not just a bag of elements. Those elements are organized. If you're a religious person, you think about soul. If you're a poet, you think about sort of the interactions and beauty of life in a different way. And I'm not at all denigrating those ways of thinking about life. What I want to talk about today is the power of this particular lens for answering questions about global change in particular. So why is this so powerful? Well, from the formula of all life, you can see a bunch of interesting things. The first is that we are mostly water. So hydrogen and oxygen mostly in a ratio of 2 to 1 or close to it. In humans, a little bit more than 2 to 1. The reason that we are so dependent on water is that our bodies are built of it. Life is mostly water. If you look at carbon, which is the next most important element, and you'll often hear people say we're carbon-based life forms, carbon is the energy carrier of all life. And so what we do with carbon is we change its chemical state to store energy, and then we change it back to release that energy. This is an example of that. When you eat food, you're breaking down organic material and it's providing energy. When you burn gasoline, you're breaking down organic material, combining it with oxygen, releasing energy and carbon dioxide. It's basically the same process as when we eat food. So carbon is life's energy source. If you look at the last few elements on the list, nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, and calcium as well, these are the nutrients in food that are sort of required for the other elements, the other pieces of our body. So for example, amino acids have a lot of nitrogen. DNA is held together by a phosphorus backbone. They're not hugely abundant, but they're key building blocks to the proteins that make up our bodies. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the building blocks upon which that are scaffolded on our carbon and water background. Okay, so the availability of these elements, if you look through this lens, what you realize, of course, is that life is a relentless competition for water, carbon, and nutrients. And so the availability of these actually controls the amount of life on Earth. It's kind of a crazy concept, right? In some way, we don't actually think about there being much of a limit to the amount of life on Earth, but the amount of life on Earth has changed over time, and it has changed over time because of evolutionary innovations that have allowed the capture of more carbon and more nitrogen and more phosphorus. What I want to do today is tell a story, three vignettes, about evolutionary steps that have radically changed the availability of these elements. It's a long story. It takes about 3.5 billion years, as I said at the beginning, and I will promise to go more quickly than that. But occasionally, a life form evolves that can change the availability of these elements. And those life forms, those evolutionary innovators, have the ability to change the world. And in order to explain to you why that is, I need to step a little back from the bio side of my biogeochemistry and very, very briefly talk about the geo, or the geology side. So how do these organisms change the world? This is a picture taken obviously from above the Earth's atmosphere. You can see the curvature of the Earth in the picture. It's an International Space Station, I believe, photograph. And in that ever so thin and fragile atmosphere, right, are 4 key gases that regulate our climate. So Earth is warmed by the rays of the sun, but the blanket that keeps it warm enough for life to persist are these 4 greenhouse gases that live in the atmosphere. Those are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor. And if you look at the chemical formulas of these that are popped up after the words, what you'll notice is the very same elements that are key to our life as well: carbon, nitrogen, and water. And so if an organism can dramatically change the amount of CO2 or methane or nitrous oxide or water vapor in the atmosphere, they can actually change the temperature and the conditions under which all life exists. And this is no easy feat, but it has happened in the past. Okay, you might say that that's unrealistic, but I want to show you a little video to show you actually that small changes like this are relatively common. What this is a video showing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the course of the year 2006. I can start it on today, which I believe is the 27th, just for fun. And what you can see is high carbon dioxide concentrations in the northern hemisphere, where we have a lot of industrial activity, lower concentrations in the southern hemisphere. And when I say that life can change the atmosphere, it's rare for that to happen on a big scale, but it happens every day and every year on a small scale. So what I want you to watch is the northern hemisphere. Okay? So what you're seeing now are the winds carrying carbon dioxide sort of across the northern hemisphere. And as we move into May and the middle of May, what you're starting to watch is the drop from red to more yellow to more blue. And over the course of the summer, you'll see that that becomes really pronounced. And what's happening there is that the leaves in the temperate forests of North America and of the northern hemisphere and grasslands are beginning to soak up more carbon dioxide than the underlying soil emits. And that draws down the amount of CO2. This is the breathing of the northern hemisphere. Of course, this is not a permanent change, because in the fall, those leaves will fall to the ground, begin to rot, and that CO2 will be re-released. As we move into the fall, you'll see that red continue to grow. Now, that's a small change. It's an annual change. It's not a global change that is dramatic, but it is an indication that life can change the world. This is a complicated figure, but it's actually meant to be read just like a clock. So this is the history of life, history of Earth. It's a 4.5 billion year history starting right at 12 o'clock. Going around through time, okay, you see not much life on Earth, the beginning of life on Earth here in this purple area called the Archean. Multicellular life doesn't evolve until somewhere right around, let's say 10:30 or 11 o'clock on this chart. And humans, the first hominids, don't come in until this black line, which in reality would be too thin to see if it was done to scale. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories. The first one is about bacteria coming in at about 3 billion years ago. The second one is about land plants, the first colonization of land by plants about 400 million years ago. and the last one is about us. So let's jump right into it. This is what I've titled, and others as well, the biggest environmental change in the history of the planet. Now, the science of this actually goes back to the 1700s. A chemist and clergyman named Joseph Priestley was trying to understand what air was made of. And he was doing these experiments where he would burn a candle in an airtight bell jar, and invariably the candle would go out. And he was very puzzled by this. He didn't understand why it wouldn't continue to burn. He did other experiments that perhaps would not be considered quite as ethical today, where he would put a mouse in the bell jar. And he noted that invariably the mouse would end up dying after a relatively short time. And then he realized that if he put a sprig of mint in with the mouse, the system could persist forever. And so what he noted was, quote, "After some months, I found that the air would neither extinguish the candle, nor was it all inconvenient to a mouse." I love that phrase. And from that, he concluded that air was not an unalterable thing. This was a radical discovery in the late 1770s. What we now know is that air today is very different from air during Earth's first 2 billion years. And the reason for that is actually tightly linked to the history of life on Earth. So what was air like long ago? Well, air was mostly nitrogen, as it is today. But unlike today, there was no oxygen. Our atmosphere today is about 20%, 21% oxygen. There was none of that oxygen in the air of the early Earth. And if you and I were there, we would suffocate as a result, as would any other multicellular life form. The Earth was kept warm mostly by the greenhouse gas methane, which is a carbon-based greenhouse gas. And the only thing to remember about this, and it's really important for the next couple of slides, is that methane doesn't do so well when it's exposed to oxygen. It readily combusts. As an aside, methane is mostly what natural gas is, which is why you can burn natural gas in your furnace. So, life on early Earth was all single-celled, not even any eukaryotes, so no cells with a nucleus. It was entirely in the ocean. Not, as far as we know, there was no life on any of the continents. And it was entirely in this realm of what we call bacteria and archaea. So that life had no problem with getting water, because water in the ocean is abundant. There was plenty of water. But it still required carbon, and photosynthesis was the way that carbon got into this system. Early photosynthesis looked very different, looked slightly different from photosynthesis today, so I'm going to walk you through that. You may remember this from high school biology, but it doesn't matter if you do or not. Photosynthesis is the combination of carbon dioxide with something, in this case, hydrogen sulfide. It takes the sunlight from energy, it takes energy from sunlight, and it changes those two inorganic molecules into the building blocks of our bodies, and then some other elements. And in this case, the elements left over are water and sulfur. We don't really know when, but about 3 billion years ago, there was a really key innovation. And that was an innovation that allowed the efficiency, the ability to capture energy to really change. And it looks trivial, and it's super important. So pay attention to this. Keep your eye on the hydrogen sulfide. Early photosynthesis, which was very bad at capturing energy, carbon dioxide plus hydrogen sulfide plus sunlight. New photosynthesis evolves. The only thing that changes is that rather than using hydrogen sulfide, it uses water. And the other thing that changes is that a byproduct of that reaction is oxygen, the O2 upon which we all depend. That probably changed the amount of life on Earth by about 10 times. The simple evolution of a process that was more efficient at capturing energy boosted the amount of life on Earth by 10-fold. But as you know from the beginning of this talk, we do not live on carbon and water alone. We need nitrogen. And nitrogen, although it's super abundant in the atmosphere, is in a form that is unavailable to most life. But again, early in Earth's history, and we don't know exactly when, there was an evolutionary process that evolved, an enzyme that evolved that could take the inert nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into a usable form. And that then could be the building block for all proteins. Again, we don't know when, but probably around 3 billion years ago, an organism evolved that could do both this new photosynthesis that produced oxygen and was very efficient, and this other process of capturing nitrogen in the same cell. Interestingly enough, it was our friends, the cyanobacteria that I showed you before. These are still very common organisms today. So what happens when this incredible innovation occurs? Cyanobacteria begin to bloom, they take over huge swaths of the ocean, and they begin pumping out oxygen. From its perspective, from the bacteria's perspective, this is just a pollutant that's being released to the atmosphere. It doesn't make any difference, or being released to the ocean and then to the atmosphere. But over time, oxygen began to accumulate. And as we know now in the modern era, pollution has consequences. The reason oxygen had consequences is because it destroyed the methane that was keeping Earth warm. So the greenhouse gas that was keeping the planet insulated and unfrozen was destroyed by this pollutant. It took hundreds of millions of years for this to happen, but happen it did. And by about 2.4 billion years ago, there was enough pollution to change the atmosphere in a really profound way. So what happened? The Earth froze over. We had at least as far as we know, the first global glaciation. Most life on Earth disappeared. And the tree of life was changed forever in ways that we will never really know because we have no fossil record. But the key to this is that the reason for this is that an organism evolved better access to energy and food. So that's story one, the bacteria. Story two is about land plants. We are now almost all the way through Earth history, a mere 400 million years ago, but still before the dinosaurs. Plants make their way out of the ocean onto land. This is what the continents looked like back then. It's an unrecognizable world in some ways, right? Nothing was where it is today. Now, plants moving onto land had to solve a lot of problems. They had to solve the water problem, the H2O problem, because they didn't live in the ocean, but they had access to a lot of sunlight because they could then all of a sudden colonize continents that had previously been unoccupied. And they had special access to this element phosphorus, over here, the P, because phosphorus comes not from the atmosphere, but from rocks. And the continents are a place where plants can get in touch with rocks intimately, as opposed to the ocean where things are floating in the water and separated from the rocks beneath. So many evolutionary innovations allowed plants the ability to do this, and it took almost 100 years for them to move out of the swampy lowlands and across the continents. But once these evolutionary innovations occurred, woody roots to access water, trees to reach up for the sunlight so that they didn't get shaded out, and roots to access nutrients stored in rocks, plants were able to spread across the then tropical planet, and in doing so, they massively increased the amount of living tissue on the planet. Tropical forests spread all over the world. They were doing so in an atmosphere that was kept warm by carbon dioxide, no longer methane, because methane had been destroyed during the oxygenation of the Earth. And these plants were so abundant and had so much access to nutrients and energy that they actually consumed a huge amount of CO2 out of the atmosphere. What happens when you dramatically reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? Well, we had yet another global glaciation. Plant life, the very success of the plants themselves, the success of the plants themselves precipitated their own demise because they had such a profound atmospheric impact that the climate they evolved in was no longer there. The world was no longer tropical. It became glaciated. It is one of the 6 mass extinction events that we know about in the history of modern life. And again, the tree of life was changed forever. So that brings us to our third story, which is humans, and links, I think, a little bit to what I do not as a biogeochemist, but also in the Provost office working on sustainability. Because this understanding of how organisms change the world can very much inform how we can think about living through the 21st century in a way that does not dramatically alter the systems upon which we all depend. So of course, humans have been, like plants before them and cyanobacteria before them, a wildly successful species or group of organisms. This is simply a graph showing from the last 2,000 years of population growth by continent. We're up now quite a bit. We're actually up to 7.7 billion in the year 2020, so this is out of date. And one might ask, what makes humans so successful as a species? Are we unique? In some ways, we certainly are, but in other ways, not so much. So like plants and cyanobacteria, we have the same fundamental constraints: water, energy, and nutrients. So where do we get our water? Well, we get our water from altering the availability of water for everything else. We build dams, we excavate groundwater. In some places, we're beginning to use energy to desalinize salt water. But there, just as an example of our footprint on the planet, there is now 3 times more water stored in reservoirs than in all of the world's rivers combined. It's kind of a sobering thought. Now, of course, we cannot succeed with just water because we have needs for carbon. This is a pile of coal. And we found a way of getting energy, not the same as the plants, but actually not too different. We're doing this, we're using the remains of dead plants in coal and oil and natural gas. And we're taking the energy that those plants captured by photosynthesis long ago and just releasing it back out to the atmosphere. It's actually chemically almost exactly the same process as what happens when you eat a plant. It's just happening outside your body and a little bit more violently than what happens when you eat a plant. Of course, we know that burning coal and other fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide and is changing the atmosphere in exactly the way you would predict, and exactly the way that our predecessors did, but we're doing it way faster. What about nutrients? Well, indeed, we have changed those even more dramatically than we are changing carbon dioxide. So nitrogen and phosphorus are necessary for agriculture. For those of you from farming communities or who have ever seen a bag of fertilizer, you'll see fertilizer is labeled as NPK. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In the 20th century, some very brilliant scientists early in the 20th century figured out how to capture nitrogen from the air. We became the first organism other than a single-celled organism to be able to take the nitrogen that we are all bathed in and transform it into a usable form for food. And as a result, humans now capture more nitrogen than all other organisms on the planet combined. We also figured out, like the plants did, that we can attack rock directly to get phosphorus. And now the amount of phosphorus that's coming out of rock has quadrupled as a result of our activity. Unfortunately, when those nutrients are lost from our farms or in our lawns or from the sewers that our waste flows through, they fuel growth in places where we don't want it. So the reason that we, for example, have so many fish kills in Narragansett Bay and downstream from any other agricultural area on the planet is because of the runoff of these nutrients that are fueling our growth, but fueling other things' growth as well. So I guess I hope to convince you from this talk that in some sense, it is absolutely no surprise that humans are changing the world. Like all the other organisms, or I should say the few organisms that have managed to do this in the past, we are simply figuring out a better way to enhance our chemistry. We are capturing water, we are capturing carbon, which is an energy source, and we are enhancing nutrients so that we can grow more. We have overcome in this way in the 20th century life's most basic limitations. And unlike the cyanobacteria, whose effects were not felt for hundreds of millions of years, or the plants, whose effects were not felt for probably 100 million years, we have done this in essentially 100 years, which is kind of overwhelming. And we have also done it not just for carbon and for nitrogen, as the cyanobacteria did, and not just for carbon and phosphorus, as the plants did, but we've done it for all of them. So like our predecessors, our access to life's essentials are changing the world. But unlike our predecessors, we can see what is coming, and we can use what we know about how the Earth system works to mitigate the consequences of our decisions. We can eliminate our greenhouse gas emissions by using alternative energy sources. And as the Provost mentioned at the beginning, this is something we're taking very seriously at Brown, but it's something we as a species need to take seriously because it is ultimately the most pressing issue that we face in the 21st century. And I say that in the full knowledge of the fact that we are all stuck in our houses right now, facing an incredibly pressing issue. We can reduce the flow of excess nutrients to the environment. Two ways to do that are eating less red meat and wasting less fertilizer. And we can learn to reuse water. And this is happening already in some places, but it's something that we can all do as, there are ways to do this. And this is probably the least pressing of the three. These now form the core principles that were articulated in the sustainability plan at Brown. We're thinking about sustainability here as trying to grapple with the fundamental chemical alterations that we as a species and we as a campus are making to the planet, with a knowledge drawn from the past, but applied to the present and the future. We can use what we know to build a sustainable future. And I hope that this talk has impressed upon you the incredible importance of doing that. We are one of the very few species that has the ability to radically change life on Earth. There will certainly be life long after humans are gone, but living through the transition may be tricky if we do not think carefully about the unintended consequences of our incredible success. After all, we live in a bell jar that is a planet, and we do not want the future to be inconvenient to the mouse, which is us. So I'll stop there. I'll say thank you, and I will leave it to the host to facilitate questions. Thank you very much.
Great. So this is Marissa Quinn, actually, and I'm moderating some of the questions that are coming in. One, Stephen, is, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. Several people have sent thanks, and this is one question. How confident are you that we humans will make the changes you've suggested and outlined to mitigate the impacts that we've made?
I guess I am confident that we will make the changes that are necessary, but I'm not confident that we will do them as quickly as we should to avoid the worst possible consequences. It's already clear, and has been clear for some time, for example, that we have not acted quickly enough on climate change. Rhode Island, as an example, is the first state to have already warmed up 2 degrees Celsius in the United States. Sea level rise is going to hurt our state and our country a lot in the next 50 years, and there's almost nothing we can do about it. Having said that, one thing I think that the media does a very poor job of is saying, like, either we fix it or we don't fix it. And, you know, it's sort of a black and white, good or bad kind of thing. In reality, everything we do to limit our emissions of greenhouse gases and to reduce our flow of nutrients into the environment is going to help a lot. More is better, but it is not either or. And so, yes, we are too late to avoid some consequences, but we are not too late to avoid the worst consequences. And, you know, business as usual leads to an almost unimaginable world by the end of this century. But we are definitely capable of avoiding that worst case scenario. And I think one of the real problems with very big problems is that we tend to say, oh my God, there's nothing I can do about it. You know, it's just gonna, like, we're just gonna have to take what comes. And I think that is not the right answer to this. The right answer is we're gonna have to do as much as we possibly can, and we will still endure some consequences, but they'll be a lot better than if we hadn't done anything.
Okay, here's another question related to that. If we don't do anything, do you believe the decimation of human life due to warming of the planet is inevitable?
So I don't know. I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by decimation. So I don't think that humans are going to go extinct as a result of climate change. And I don't think it would be impossible for humans to live in a world where, for example, there was no winter and it was a globally tropical world, which is not impossible and has happened in the geologic past. I do think a couple of really important things. First, the people who have done the least to cause the problem are going to suffer the most in the transition, and that is a huge moral consideration. So that's one thing, because they'll have the fewest resources to adapt. And the other is that, again, even if the human species doesn't disappear as a result of climate change, and I don't think it will, certainly the degree of suffering is directly linked to how bad climate change gets. And so I do think that business as usual will lead to a very, very difficult 21st century as we have to evacuate our coasts, as our crops fail, as millions and millions and perhaps hundreds of millions of people are on the move as climate changes in the regions where they live. And so to avoid those scenarios and to avoid the sort of human conflict that comes with those scenarios, I think it's really important that we act quickly. I don't think it's the end of the human race, but I do think the amount of suffering really depends on how much we act now and how dramatically we act.
Thank you. So there's been much observed in the media about the positive impact from diminished emissions and pollution because of the sudden economic closure caused by the pandemic.
Yep.
Guidance or opportunity does reentry offer for healthier environmental measures?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously with us all staying at home and nobody driving and so forth, there have been drops in emissions. In terms of global warming emissions, they've actually been fairly modest. In terms of air pollution and air quality, they've been dramatic. I have a student in India who says that in Punjab, you can now see the Himalayas for the first time in living memory. So it's been very dramatic in terms of air pollution. You know, it's very clear that I'm not in charge of what the global economy does, but it would certainly be a good time to think about a massive stimulus package as part of an energy transition. This isn't, the government is spending a lot of money to try and keep people afloat. And I think that there's an opportunity, but I would defer to people who know much more about policy than I as to how that might come about. But I don't think the drop in emissions is going to markedly change the trajectory of climate. I think that forward-thinking people might see this as an opportunity to, as we rebuild from this crisis, invest in newer technologies, not older technologies. But whether that happens or not, I would defer to people with much more expertise than myself, including the Provost and many others. So, yeah, I don't know.
Here's a couple of people have written with this similar question, and that is, are there places in this country or around the world that are offering insights to things that can be done well, that we could all learn from?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, Iowa is a place that I would point to as a place where we can learn to do things well. So Iowa, a decade ago, if you drove through Iowa, you would see corn and soybeans. It's the most physically altered state in the union. Today, if you go to Iowa, you see corn and soybeans and windmills. And they actually have so much electricity being produced by windmills that they're selling it out of state to Chicago. The beauty of it is that farmers love windmills because they provide a steady stream of income and do not interfere with farm machinery. So they can be placed in a way that doesn't impact farm operation and is not dependent on the commodity price of soybeans or corn, to which they are very vulnerable. Iowa is also an interesting example because there are people there doing incredibly innovative work on how to reduce the amount of nutrient flowing off of farms. So there's been a lot of beautiful work done to show that if you plant strips of prairie in the right way in land that farmers aren't interested in using particularly much, you can keep your farm profits the same as they are, but reduce your nutrient losses by like 80 or 90%. And actually Smithfield Farms and others are now adopting this strategy all across all of their property in the US. And that's work that's come out of Iowa State. So it's an interesting example of a lot of things we could do well. I think it doesn't, there are other places, obviously, all over the world. The Netherlands is way in front of us on alternative energy and heating. And actually Brown has turned to consultants from Denmark to think about how we might transition our energy away from fossil fuels as well. So there are lots of bright spots out there. I think that we need a coordinated effort, and that's merging together all of these bright spots into a unified policy. That's where we haven't gone yet. But the beauty of this, this is a very grim topic, and I understand that, but we know what to do. Like, we don't know all the details, but we have the technology and the understanding of the Earth system to do this so much better than we're doing it. And it's not the knowledge that's holding us back. It's really the will and the political will. So, I think that if you ask any of us in the sort of global change science community what the most important thing you can do is, I think the most important thing you can do is raise this issue to the top of your voting scorecard, because we need leaders who are going to enact the policies that we know will work and end the policies that we know are causing the problem. And it doesn't require a miracle or incredible scientific advance. It requires political will.
That's great. Okay, that looks like it's the end of our questions. I will turn it back to the Provost, and he may have a final question or word to add.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Stephen, for that terrific talk, and it's wonderful to see the photos interspersed with the chemical composition.
Yeah, sorry about all the chemical formulas.
Yeah, no, the formulas are great. If there's, maybe you just answered that in terms of the political scorecard. If there's one thing that all of us listening to you today should do, what is that thing?
Yeah, I guess from a global societal perspective, I would say the political scorecard is it. But the other thing that I really try to advise people is focus on the big things that you can change and give yourself a break on the little things. So, the big footprint that you have are your house, your car, your food, and your flights. And so things you can do, next time you do a home renovation, think about, well, can I add insulation? Can I change my heating system? Next time you buy a car, electric car or plug-in hybrid is going to be a dramatic reduction in your emissions. And those emissions are probably 30 to 50% of your life, depending on where you live and how much you fly. Do you really need to fly all of the time that you fly? I'm talking to you particularly and myself as well, right? And then if you can reduce the amount of red meat in your diet, that will have a profound effect. Those are the 4 areas. That's not one, but those are the 4 big buckets that we need to think about. And don't worry so much about all the other things that are coded as sustainability and drive you bonkers, like what straw, should I get a straw, or paper versus plastic, or, those things matter if you really want to get into the details, but focus on the big ones and give yourself a little break, because there's just too much to worry about.
Great. Well, thank you for that advice. And certainly the last 7-8 weeks of forced social isolation has certainly shown me that we can do lots of things without getting on airplanes, which is wonderful on many, many different levels. Thank you, Stephen, for this terrific talk and for giving us your time today. I know you're extremely busy. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Stephen. And please, everyone, stay safe, stay healthy. At least in my neighborhood of Providence, Rhode Island, the sun is out today, so please go out and get some sun, and look forward to seeing you in person someday in the not too distant future. Take care, and thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.